Well, hello there. If you want to see how we built this one-of-a-kind treehouse, keep on watching. Let's get started. With any good treehouse build, it always starts with the tree. And luckily for me, I'm in the Pacific Northwest and there's plenty of trees to be had, but in my particular backyard, I have this one mammoth tree that I actually paid thousands of dollars to trim up first before we even started on the treehouse. And that's mainly because there were numerous dead branches that I wanted to remove first, so there's less likelihood of falling debris. But now that our tree is trimmed, we can get to the foundation. There are obviously numerous different types of tree houses that you can build, but because of our personal circumstance where the tree is right up against our fence line, I had to be a bit creative with the overall structure itself, which is why I'm going to be building a framed structure around our tree versus drilling straight into it, along with my personal belief that's probably going to be more beneficial to the overall longevity and health of the tree itself. I removed all the loose bark to get down to topsoil, then applied a weed barrier and brought in some crushed rock. This particular product that I'm using is 5/8 crushed minus, which is a perfect product to use for a proper foundation structure as long as you have 3 to 4 inches of crushed base below. Once the crushed rock is dumped out into the areas that I need it, I smooth it out somewhat evenly with a rake. Just know that it doesn't have to be perfectly smooth for this application. And that's mainly due to how we're going to frame up this entire structure after we compress our rock. And by compressing, all I'm doing is applying a hand tamper and going over this area multiple times in different directions. Once I go over all areas very thoroughly, I can finally move on to our footers. And for our footers, we're using these Tough blocks by Build Tough. Now, if you've watched the channel before, you know that I've used these footers numerous times, and especially on low profile decks, but this is the first time that I'm going to be using them on a raised deck surface, or in this case, a treehouse. I am somewhat limited to the size of the treehouse frame because I'm building our framework strictly off of our raised retaining wall. The majority of our treehouse frame is going to consist of 12 feet wide by 10 feet deep, but there is going to be a side walkway area that's approximately 5 feet wide on one side of the tree, which is why we have a smaller section of footers here. On most projects pertaining to Tough blocks, I recommend a overhang of 1 foot, so I do calculate that measurement on both sides and then make sure that our Tough block is perfectly level. Now obviously with our crushed rock, it's most likely not going to be perfect level the very first time, but with the crushed rock being crushed rock, it's easy to maneuver into position so we are perfectly level. Once we're level in both directions, I can move on to the next footer. So on and so forth. I do this to every single one, and once every single Tough block is perfectly level, I take a string line and string it across to make sure we have proper alignment across all the footers. A second string line is placed perpendicularly to the one that we just previously installed, and with our Tough blocks perfectly aligned, we can move on to some measuring. Now the beautiful thing about the system is that we don't actually have to have every single footer at the same exact elevation or height. But that's where our laser level comes into play, because every single elevation is going to be different between one footer to the next. In order to make the cutting process easier for the entire area, all I have to do is a little bit of math on one of these footers. I want this one to be at 3 feet tall. Therefore, I have to subtract my beam height, my joist height, my deck thickness, as well as the height of our footer. Take all that, subtract it by 36 inches, and we get 14.5 inches. That is exactly where I have my laser level pointed out. And that way I can go to every single one of these footers and note and see exactly where that laser level line matches up. That's going to be the exact measurement that I'm going to be cutting that specific post. Our 4x4 material fits nice and snugly into each individual Tough block. The very top of each post is perfectly aligned with our laser level. That's exactly what we're going for in this application. We just need to get each one installed. And this is a perfect time to say a huge thank you to our sponsor this week, Tough blocks by Build Tough. Now I've used them on numerous projects and they have been a sponsor and a supporter of the BYOT channel, and it's a trusted true product, so I am personally happy to use it in a multitude of applications. They're made from 100% recycled material, weigh much less than your standard concrete foundation block, as well as can hold up to 1,700 pounds a piece, which is plenty of structural support for this treehouse. If interested in learning more about the product line, I will make sure and have a link in the description box below, but till then, let's get back to the project. After I place a galvanized post cap at every single location, I bring over the big guys, and the big guys are these large 4x8 by 12 feet long beams. In order to connect them securely to our posts, I double check the plumbness of our posts first and then install some galvanized screws connecting each post to beam connection. I like these galvanized brackets specifically because I'm able to tack these brackets into place with some screws, but I'm also able to come back around at the tail end and install some galvanized through bolts if I want some added structural support. As far as alignment goes from beam to beam to beam, it's actually quite simple because we already did all the legwork with the alignment of our footers, and because of that, all I need to do is make sure that the distance between the very end of our beam to where the center point of our bracket is the same exact length on all 4 beams. With that simple calculation accounted for, we are good to fasten all these beams accordingly and move on to some flashing tape. And of course, since I am in my very own backyard, my daughter and son have been definitely wondering what dad is building outside. And anytime my daughter asks to be a part of a project, I personally just have to say yes and enjoy the fact that she actually does want to help build with dad. Even if it's just making sure that the waterproofing membrane that we're applying to our beams is applied properly. With our flashing tape perfectly applied, we are ready to start bringing in our joists. Now our joists are just going to be laid upon the very tops of all of our beams, but there are going to be multiple sizes in our specific application. The one section where we're going to be connecting all 3 beams together is going to have 18-foot long joists, but the other areas are going to be only 10 feet long. But if you know framing, this is the moment of truth because we need to double check to make sure we have proper levelness. And if you did it right, this is one of my all-time favorite parts of any framing project. I bring in our 2x6 by 10 foot material, and that's going to be the material that's going to be going right up against the very front of our tree. Once all this material is in place, it's time to do some cutting. I start by taking the distance between the end of our beams to approximately 2 to 3 inches away from the tree trunk itself. In our circumstance, this measurement is approximately 5 feet, so that board is measured, cut, and marked at joist placements for every 16 inches on center. I line up our joists based upon our markings and secure them appropriately with 3-inch long galvanized ring shank nails. Of course, it's a little tight with our fence line right up against our nailer, but we're able to make do, and once all of our boards are properly fastened, I can then push this entire section right up against our fence where I want it. I do the same exact process to all of our 10-foot long joists and then push that back right up against the tree. Now again, I am leaving a couple inches of space in between our framing and our tree just for natural tree growth over the next couple of decades. With our framing position where I want it on one side, I want to stabilize this entire structure by using some hurricane ties. Now these hurricane ties or hurricane straps are being placed at every single beam to joist location. And as far as application is concerned, I'm going to be using my metal connection framing nailer, which shoots out 1.5 inch long galvanized nails. Now, I'm certainly not worried about any hurricane force winds coming into the Pacific Northwest, but it's always good practice to install this type of metal connection even for a treehouse because it really stiffens up the entire structure and makes it a lot easier to walk on once we get to that point. With all of our hurricane ties positioned properly and secured to our beam, I then go back to every single one and start nailing off our hurricane ties to our joists. Personally, for me, it's now safe to walk on, we just need to cut it down to size. We did have quite a bit of excess lumber, especially on those 18 footers, which is why I grabbed a simple chalk line, snapped a line, and that way I have a precise area where I need to cut every single board off. You can use a speed square to help you stay straight and honest, but personally, I generally use just my circular saw and stabilize the excess lumber with my free hand. If you don't have to worry about much excess lumber, you can always just have 2 stabilizing hands on your circular saw, which definitely makes the cutting process easier when cutting vertically up. With all the ends of the boards cut to the appropriate size, I can then start nailing off our rim joists. Prior to getting this board up there, I did mark 16 inches on center for all of our joists, but they should be properly aligned already because of where the hurricane ties were placed. With pressure-treated lumber, I was quite lucky with the fact that the vast majority of all these boards were perfectly straight. However, there were two ends that were slightly high. In order to get them down to size, I just took my hand planer and planed them down at this location just to make sure that it lined up nicely with the boards right next to it, and that will make the decking installation process a lot easier. Just a simple tip to keep in mind if this does happen to you, and as you can see, a lot flatter across that entire plane. The vast majority of all of our framing is accounted for, but now we need to do some blocking. The blocking should be placed in the very center of our beams, and the easiest way to do that is to make a mark on both sides, take a chalk line, snap a line, and that way we have a perfectly straight line all the way across for our blocking to be applied and nailed to. Blocking is recommended at these locations because it not only stiffens up the entire structure, but it also prevents our joists from warping over the years, and it's a simple process to do in a matter of an hour, so I always suggest doing it. And yes, is it a bit overkill for a treehouse build? Most likely, but if we're going to be building this, we might as well be building it the right way. And speaking of building the right way, this is joist tape. This specific product is from G-Tape, and I always suggest applying it to the tops of all of your joists before you get to decking, because nowadays, since all of our decking is generally composite, it'll last longer than our joists, and this is just an extra area and layer of protection for our joists, so the moisture from precipitation is less likely to rot our joists over time. With our joist tape fully applied, it's now finally time for some decking. This decking might look familiar because I also used this on a low profile deck in our backyard a few months back, and it's from Trex. I'll make sure and leave a link for this product as well as all the other tools and materials needed for this project in the description box below if you are interested. The vast majority of all of our decking is 12 feet long, however, I did get some 16-foot sticks because of our 5-foot wide walkway on the side of our tree, and that means I can get 3 pieces of decking off of this one 16-foot stick. This particular Trex product is very budget friendly, but I am still conscious of trying to make sure that I'm not using any more material than I absolutely have to on this project because it is, a treehouse. I make my way over to the very front lip of our deck, and because all of our deck boards are grooved, I can install this initial starter clip system. I line the side of the clip up with the very edge of our rim joist. Once it's installed, I then run a string line all the way down in order to snap a line and have a very distinct edge to work off of when installing the rest of our clips. With our starter row of clips installed, I can squeeze the groove of the deck board right into it, and that secures it on one side. However, on the other side, we're going to be installing these. These are camo fasteners, and I've used them in a couple different videos, but personally this is my favorite way to install a deck if I want it installed very quickly and efficiently. This system provides plenty of strength, but the real caveat and key to this entire system is the ease and speed of installation. All I have to do is apply this clip to every single joist location and then slide each board in position. Once that board is slid into place, it's time to start screwing. In order to make it even easier, I use this clamp system that clamps down on one of the joists, and it squeezes all the boards together so you have consistency in your grooves, and it's a lot easier to install all these fasteners all at once if you do have some type of a device holding everything together while you're installing them. What makes this system even better is that it does come with a never miss guide that you just place right on top of each screw, which not only aligns your drill bit with the head of your screw perfectly every single time, but it also has a predetermined depth gauge so you're not over drilling your screws. Another nice added bonus for these fasteners is that they have a built-in spacer of 3/16 of an inch, which means that it takes even more of the guessing game out of the installation process because you know your deck boards are going to have a consistent spacing all the way across while only having to worry about the fasteners themselves. And not any secondhand deck spacers are going to be needed in the end. As we get closer and closer to our tree and install our final row of decking on one side, it becomes quite obvious that we need a bit more framing in order to fit our decking in nice and smoothly as a transition from one section to the next. I install a bit more framing and cut one of the deck boards at a 45-degree angle on one side. Once that section is cut at the appropriate angle and size, I fit it up right against our tree and figure out exactly where the next 45-degree angle piece needs to be made. Now there is space in between the decking and our tree, and if eventually over time that tree starts hitting our decking, I am going to cut it back to size, but at this point it's basically exactly where I want it. And of course I can't forget about this little section. Now I do use my camo fasteners wherever I can, but in some instances I am going to have to use some Cortex fasteners that have plugs and caps. More on that later. As I finish off the remaining section of decking, it looks great and clean, however, we obviously have to cut off all the excess on the sides of the deck because we want a perfectly clean look. In order to make this cut clean and straightforward, I take a chalk line, mark my line as to exactly where the end of our joist is, and then set up a guide. You certainly don't have to use a guide if you don't want to, and you can just eyeball it as needed, but I find even if I'm good with a circular saw, it's always nice to rest that circular saw edge up against a straight blade like a level. You also want to preset your blade depth because you don't want to go too far into your pressure treated lumber, so I just do a hair under the thickness of your decking, and that way it doesn't cut through into your lumber and you're easily able to remove all those pieces at the tail end. At this point in time, we are good to go with our treehouse deck. However, in order to make this as clean of a deck as possible, we want to install a bit of fascia. Now the fascia boards themselves are approximately 3/4 of an inch thick by 7.5 inches wide. I first take a 2-foot long section, cut in half, and then place a 45-degree angle on one side of each board. That basically provides me a very easy way to apply a mitered corner at this location without having to hold up two massive sections of fascia board. I first apply some clear construction adhesive at these locations, then clamp one edge down, and once one side is in, I then start screwing each piece in place. I am using Cortex fasteners at these locations, which means I'm able to drill straight into the center of our boards, but I'm also able to hide those holes at the tail end of the video with some decking plugs. This construction adhesive just provides more bond strength for the overall fascia board, but it's also important to apply it in a vertical direction because if there is moisture that gets back behind there, you want that moisture to have the ability to run down the side of the board and not get trapped behind the board. This just prevents the likelihood of rot over time, especially if you're in areas where you have a lot of precipitation like the Pacific Northwest. Our treehouse deck space might not be super high off the ground, but it's high enough where we're going to need a railing. And in order to do so, and to make it more budget friendly, we're going to be using some pressure treated lumber and cutting our own railing down to size. Each post is cut at 41.5 inches, and that's going to be giving us a railing height of 3 feet. And now you might be asking yourself, Brent, that math don't make sense. Well, you haven't considered the fact that we're going to have a notch at the very base of each post at 7 inches. Now that notch is 1.5 inches deep into our 3.5 inch nominal post, and this 1.5 inches deep cut off of our miter saw is preset so I am not going too far into our post. Once all these cuts are made, I bring every single post over to our table saw, which will cut the vast majority of our notch out. The only problem is that the blade height on our table saw is not tall enough, so we have to do this cut twice, one on one side, then flip the fence over and do it on the opposite side. We just need to be dead nuts accurate to make sure that that blade is hitting the exact same mark on the opposite side. And just as a side note, I did make a mark on the top of my fence to indicate exactly how far I needed to push our 4x4 material into that 1.5 inch mark that we made on our miter saw so we don't go too far into our 4x4 post. The only problem with having some type of stopping point is that there is a very small amount at the base of this cut where it needs to be removed because we didn't cut it all the way through. Luckily for us, an oscillating multi-tool makes quick work of this area, so once cut and flush, we're ready to start installing. In order to attach our railing post to our deck, we need some sizable fasteners, and to make it easy on us for installation purposes, I pre-drill all of my holes for each individual post. Working my way from the bottom up, I make a mark at 2 inches as well as 5 inches and drill a 1/2 inch diameter hole. Many people, including myself, have installed galvanized through bolts at this location, but I'm going to be using something a little bit different in this application, which I'll explain shortly. We have all of our posts pre-drilled and ready to install, but what are we going to place in between those posts? That's where these screens come into play. If you've seen the channel before, you might have recognized these because this was a part of a pergola that I installed on a deck right below us. But I took that pergola down because it just didn't fit the space, but I really wanted to repurpose these screens because they were so cool, vibrant, and I love a floral print. So we're gonna repurpose these in between these posts along with some 2x4 pressure treated material as well, and see how it all comes together. Anywhere a post is going to be placed, I suggest installing a little added blocking behind it just to give it a little bit more meat to catch, especially when we're going to be installing these guys. This is Through Lock by Fasten Master, and it takes a replacement of through bolts. The extremely nice advantage to this product is that you don't have to pre-drill anything. It goes straight through our pressure treated lumber along with any type of composite out there like butter, but it is nice to have pre-drilled holes into your posts at least, so you have something stationary and it's not going to be wiggling on you as you start drilling into your deck framing. Once I have one fastener in place, I double check my plumbness, and as long as we're plumb, I can then proceed to installing the second fastener. The only question is it still perfectly plumb on all 4 sides? Most likely not, but a simple composite shim at the very base of our post is all we need to plumb this thing up on all 4 sides. This same exact process is done on all posts, but luckily in some instances we don't even need any shims whatsoever, and we're perfectly plumb on all 4 sides once those fasteners are installed. With our first 2 posts in place, we can move on to our rails. We're going to be cutting and installing 2x4 pressure treated material at 4 feet long, and these sections are going to hold our decorative screens in place, but it's also going to provide a much needed structurability to our railing because it's going to connect each post to the next post. The only question is, how do we secure our decorative panel to these rails? Well, I found out an ingenious way to do so by just setting up a Diablo dado blade into my table saw and cutting a 1/2 inch deep notch directly into the center of one side on each board. Now, there are a few different ways to get this type of notch in your boards, but the dado set really did make this a breeze to do, and especially when considering we had a number of these boards to account for. With all of our notches taken care of, we can move on to some pre-drilling. Now this is a pocket hole jig from Craig, and I'm going to be pre-drilling 4 different hole locations at every single rail. That means 2 on each side, and the Craig jig really does make this a very easy and straightforward process because it also comes with its own drill bit that you can set at 1/2 inch or any other depth that you need based upon the thickness of your material. With our rails cut, channeled, and pre-drilled, we're now finally ready to install our next post. And I'm not even measuring the distance between each post because all I need is the rail between these 2 posts to give me an indicator of exactly the distance that I need between each one. Once the post is plumb and secure, I bring the top rail into position and screw that directly into our correlating post with 3-inch long exterior screws. With our top rail in, we can now finally move to our decorative panels. Now, because we did all the hard legwork to get to this point with our rails, the installation of our screens was actually extremely easy and straightforward. You might need to give the bottom rail a couple love taps just to get it into a snug position, but once in position, screw it down and away you can go to your next section. Each corresponding section of our railing is installed just as we did previously, which is a nice reprieve considering how much work it got to this point just to build a treehouse deck area. Now you might be thinking, Brent, this is basically just a deck, and yeah, you're right, but we are going to be dressing this entire system up with a copious amount of items, including a dome structure in the very center of our deck area. We're also going to have slides, rock climbing holds, some type of zip line, and a cornucopia of other items for my kids to play with over the next few years. Hopefully a decade or so, since my kids are still quite young. All that to say is that there is a lot to be excited for part 2 of this build that will be coming in the next couple of weeks. So stay tuned for that, and please consider subscribing to the channel if you are not already. As I make my way over to the final side that's going to be getting a railing, I do have to apply the same process of snapping a string line and running my circular saw all the way across these boards to cut them evenly in order for our posts to line up flush with the framing below. And as you may have noticed, I did not install any fascia on this side, and that's mainly due to the fact that no one's really going to see this side, along with why waste money on material no one's going to see and it's not providing any structural support. So it looks good. Let's move on to the underside of our deck. Now each one of our through lock fasteners is sticking out of our framework, and this nut/washer is designed for this application, which is why it not only provides a surface that no one's going to poke themselves with, it also tightens down those fasteners ever so slightly so you have a very strong, sturdy hold for years to come. There's of course a bit of railing cleanup to remove any excess shim work, which is easy with our oscillating multi-tool, along with plugging all of our holes of our fasteners. Just make sure that when you are plugging these holes that you're using a smooth face hammer and not a framing hammer with a waffle head. But luckily for us, I can now say that we are done with part 1 of this treehouse build. I really do absolutely love this entire build already, and we haven't even gotten to the fun part. This is pretty fun and quite stylish for a treehouse, but the real fun begins in the next video where we're going to do a whole plethora of items. If you have any suggestions on what I should put in this treehouse, please let me know in the comment section, because I might add it in there just because of your comment. But till then, this is truly one beautiful, sexy beast of a treehouse. Oh yeah,